I have three new RP2040 boards from Waveshare Electronics here with me today, and we're going to be going through them and hopefully give you enough information to decide whether you should use them or not in your projects. These boards are the RP2040, the RP2040 Plus, and the RP2040 LCD 0.96. A bit of a mouthful, that last one. Waveshare Electronics is a Chinese electronics manufacturer which makes a considerable amount of boards for Raspberry Pis, sensors, and other things. But I haven't really heard of them much before or had much experience with them. So I ordered these RP2040 boards when they were announced a couple of weeks ago. In terms of cost, the RP2040 is priced at $4.99, the RP2040 Plus comes in at $7.99, and finally the RP2040 LCD 0.96 costs $12.99. Shipping to the UK was fairly reasonable. It only cost $5 and arrived in about 2 weeks. So just looking at what you get on paper, these prices seem pretty reasonable in this day and age. But that is, of course, only one part of the puzzle when deciding if you want to purchase these boards. As we have three boards here today, it would take an age to go through them all in detail, so this video is going to be a kind of first look and overview of each of the boards, if you will. I'm going to cover their features, how they stack up against similar boards, and give you a couple of my thoughts. If you're interested in more microcontroller reviews like this, then make sure you're subscribed, as we have plenty more on the way. Okay, so let's start with the RP2040. This little board is pretty much a clone of the Pimoroni Tiny 2040, which we will be making most of our comparisons with. So, the RP2040 is obviously powered by the RP2040 chip, which was developed by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. We have featured this chip pretty heavily on this channel, but for those unfamiliar, let's go over its key specs. The RP2040 is a dual-core ARM Cortex M0 Plus running stock at 133 MHz. It has 264 KB of SRAM and two SPI, I2C and UART controllers. That's two of each. And it also has 4 analog to digital converters. It has 8 PIO state machines, USB 1.1 host and device support, as well as 16 PWM channels. The RP2040 board measures in at 18 by 23.5mm, which is slightly larger than the Pimoroni Tiny 2040, and it also has a more expansive pinout. I will put the pinout diagram up now, and you can pause the video to see if you're interested. The pinout is castellated, meaning it can be soldered to another PCB, although the rear of the RP2040 is not flat, as the actual RP2040 chip is mounted to the rear of the board. And that means a little bit more thought is going to need to be put into PCB design of a carrier board so that the pins will properly touch the corresponding pad. It also has a USB-C connector, 2 user buttons, a boot and reset button. In between these buttons is a WS2812 RGB LED. And it also has a regulator capable of providing 800 mA of current, which should be enough for any breakout board or any device you want to power from the onboard regulator. Perhaps the least impressive part of this board is that it only has 2 MB of flash storage for your programs, and that's a quarter of the 8 MB that you get with the Tiny 2040. Although the Tiny 2040 is considerably more expensive at about $11. So that's the main specs of this board. Programming, this is the same as any other RP2040 board. You can use the VS Code workflow I show you in the cards above. So in terms of my thoughts of the Waveshare RP2040, I quite like it. It has more broken out GPIO than the Tiny 2040 and costs roughly half the price. The main downside is the 2 MB of flash, which might not be enough for some projects. So if you think you need to use this extra flash, then go for the Tiny 2040. Otherwise, I quite like this board. Okay, so now moving on to the RP2040 Plus now. Again, I'm going to compare this board to another Pimoroni board. You might be spotting a theme here. This time I'm going to compare to the Pico LiPo, which costs about $13 for the 4MB flash option, or $18 for the 16MB of flash option. So the RP2040 Plus is much cheaper at only $8. These two boards share the same footprint, 21 by 51 millimeters, and they even share the same pinout, which is the same as the original Raspberry Pi Pico. The RP2040 Plus is a single-sided board, so the castellated pins make a bit more sense here. In terms of features, we of course have the RP2040 chip, and we also have 4MB of flash on board. So we can compare this board to the cheaper Pico LiPo. It has a USB connector, a single user LED, and two buttons, boot and reset. Probably the main reason you would get this board is if you wanted to use the LiPo functionality. This board can charge 3.7 volt LiPo batteries and also be powered independently by a LiPo battery. Again, much like the Pico LiPo. However, the LiPo battery header is not the same as many other boards or the fairly standard JST connectors. So if you buy a pre-crimped battery, chances are it's not going to connect properly. And this is a pretty silly oversight in my opinion. Yeah, I know that changing the connector on the end of a battery isn't challenging, but it is going to be a pain to buy another connector and crimper to crimp it yourself. I do also think that a single user LED is not enough, as it would be great to have some kind of indication that the LiPo is actually charging. Also, the connector annoyance is just one step too far to me, so I'm not so much of a fan of this board, and I would go for the Pimoroni. Now moving on to our final board, the RP2040 LCD 0.96. Now that is going to be a pain to say over and over, so I'm just going to call it the RP2040 LCD. This time I'm very pleased to say that I have no Pimoroni board to compare it to, and I actually think that this board is one of the most interesting of the ones we have seen so far. This is the most expensive board that we have tested so far, coming in at $13, but it has the most features. It shares the same pinout and form factor as the previous RP2040 Plus board, although some of the pins are reserved for the display. Yes, these features include the same LiPo battery powering and charging with that same annoying connector. It has the RP2040 on the back of the board, two buttons, a boot and reset button, and it uses a USB-C connector, although they have dropped the onboard flash down from 4MB to 2MB. So let's get to the main feature, the LCD display. This display is a color IPS display with a resolution of 160 by 80, and it appears to get reasonably bright. It's a fairly small display, but perfectly good enough to print a few lines of text for say a sensor reading or a scrolling display. I think this pairs pretty well with the onboard LiPo functionality. You could have a portable or wearable project that could be quite easy to develop with a single board. Yes, you could get a similar experience with using a breakout board with a display and then a breakout board for LiPo power, but it is really convenient to have this all incorporated into one board. It's a little bit disappointing that the flash storage has been reduced to 2MB, as this board could be used for some quite advanced projects and large programs. Keeping it at 4MB or even upping it to 8 or 16 would have been a bonus even for that little price increase. So to conclude, I think that if you are looking for a cheap alternative for some of the Pimoroni boards, then these Waveshare boards might be worth looking into. However, my favourite board of the three is the RP2040 LCD 0.9 something, as having a LiPo charger and a display on a single board is really convenient. If you are interested in a deeper dive into any of these three boards we have seen today, then let us know in the comments and we'll do a video focusing a bit deeper. Thank you for watching. If you have found this video interesting, then please do consider subscribing and liking. Thank you very much and have a nice day.